Today on Ancient Rome Live, we'll examine the Roman theater and its rich history of architecture and artistic innovation. It was never just a place for watching plays, it was a living, breathing stage, ostensibly organized with the veneration of the gods, where architecture, entertainment, and empire all came together, a symbol of Roman power. Roman theaters began with Greek inspiration, but quickly evolved into uniquely Roman spaces. So let's take a first look at Greek-style theaters. They were hillside constructions, beginning with Athens. Theater performances were held to honor the god Dionysus. Eventually, productions throughout the Greek world were held to honor other deities like Apollo. The Athenians are credited with creating the basic features of the theater, first in wood, then with stone seating. The cavea for seating around the performance space, called the orchestra for the chorus and actors. There was a scene wall in front of which the actors performed, and it would be developed over time into a full building lined with columns under the Romans. Tragedy, comedy, satyr plays, as well as mime performances were all created between the late 6th century and early 5th century BC and held in the theater. Costumes and the use of masks identified the individual characters, and the masks also served to help project the voices of the actors. We see some great examples of the masks from Pompeian frescoes, mosaics, and statuary. Originally, they were made of linen, leather, cork, and plaster. There were many innovations in enhancing the acoustics of the sites, such as a studied hemispherical shape of the cavea to amplify the sound naturally. A great example of this is to be found in the Theater of Epidaurus of the 4th century BC. It is still praised for its perfect acoustics today. Other well-preserved examples of the Greek theater in Italy are to be found in Hellenistic Pompeii and Siracusa in Sicily. And of course, we see from the steep theater of Hellenistic Pergamon that the Greeks located their theaters to take advantage of the beauty of the natural landscape in their cities. The Romans heavily borrowed from the Greeks as they came in contact with them through trade and conquest of southern Italy, Sicily, and mainland Greece. The earliest noted Roman author was Andronicus in 240 BC, who is credited with early tragedies and comedies to honor Jupiter during the Ludi Romani in the Circus Maximus. The genre and performances to honor various gods throughout the year really took off in the 2nd century BC, with authors like Plautus and Terence gaining fame. Their comedies were created in a Roman context and in Latin, though based on Greek works. It's important to note that for most of the Republican period, Romans avoided building permanent stone theaters, even though they hosted regular theatrical performances. Instead, they used temporary wooden structures similar to the ones from the Renaissance era, as we see here at the Teatro Olimpico by Palladio and the Teatro Farnese in Parma. They were erected for festivals like the Ludi Romani with chariot racing, and then dismantled afterwards, every year. In contrast, outside of Rome, there were many examples of permanent Republican-era theater temple complexes, such as in Palestrina and the Cult of Fortuna, Tivoli, and as we see in this model, Frentianum Sidicinum in the province of Caserta. In Rome, the Senate opposed permanent theaters on moral and political grounds. Theaters were seen as Greek and therefore decadent or un-Roman, and dangerous places where the masses could gather to voice their discontent or be seduced by luxuria and spectacle. As a result, no permanent theater was allowed to be constructed permanently within the Pomerium for centuries. The turning point was Pompey the Great's theater in 55 BC. As recounted by Tertullian, De Spectaculis, and echoed by later commentators, he built a temple to Venus Victrix at the top of the cavea, the seating area, and declared that the entire theater was merely a staircase to the temple. This reframed the theater as a sacred precinct rather than an entertainment venue. Worshippers ascended the seats, supposedly honoring the goddess, not watching comedy or mimes. He located his theater in the Campus Martius and included with it porticos, gardens, and a curia for the Senate. Most importantly, it was a freestanding theater made of Roman concrete and faced with opus reticulatum and set a new standard. The complex is visible on the former Urbis plan, now on display in the newly opened former Urbis Museum. You can see our video on it. You can also visit a portion of the theater when you eat at Tapangrazio that is built into the remains. Send to the basement and admire the original 55 BC walls that upheld the cavea of Rome's largest ancient theater, a trend-setting construction in late Republican Rome. Caesar, Augustus, and Balbus followed suit, with permanent theaters of their own. First, Pompey's rival Julius Caesar wanted to outdo him by creating a Greek-style theater along the slopes of the Capitoline Hill. But his land clearing eventually gave way to the construction of the Theater of Marcellus by Augustus, named after his ill-fated nephew, and it was full of innovations still standing today in the southern Campus Martius. Now, Vitruvius says in his 10 books of architecture, the Scanae fronds should be decorated with columns and statues and painted panels, lending majesty to the theater. And we can see some of that in this model of the Theater of Marcellus. We're also told that a theater should be located next to a portico. Indeed, the 3 theaters of Rome each had an adjacent portico. Pompey's is visible in the former Urbis plan. Marcellus's used the nearby portico of Octavia, and the portico remains of the theater of Balbus, the Spanish general who celebrated a triumph under Augustus, is today an archaeological site that we can visit. Another great place to come explore is the Exedra. It's going to eventually have this 8th century cistern right here, but what it was in antiquity, the apse eventually becomes, lined with marble, eventually becomes the site of a latrine in the 2nd century AD, an extraordinary space. And you can continue onward. There's a whole neighborhood that is excavated. You've got roads, late antique house, shops, just incredible. So what happened in Roman theaters? The earliest Roman performances adapted Greek models, tragedy and new comedy, but Roman tastes evolved beyond them. And in fact, by the Imperial period, Romans craved more sensational, lively performances. The mime, unmasked, often lewd performers, the pantomime, silent dance with music and masked performers, Italian farce, crude, rustic humor with stock characters like Maccus and Bucco. Now for mimes, we have an example of the performances with this particular mosaic from the Vatican depicting the dancers and the musical instruments, and we even have reconstructions of those musical instruments. Even emperors participated in the theater, both as being on display, like Augustus inaugurating the Theater of Marcellus, but also sometimes performing. Nero performed on the stage, scandalous for a Roman aristocrat, and indeed, usually musical competitions were in a separate devoted venue called the Odeon. And we have records that sometimes gladiators fought in the theaters. And in fact, in the Greek East, it's very frequent that we find the Greek theaters converted in part to accommodate gladiatorial performances by the addition of parapet walls, as we see here in the Theater of Dionysus in Athens. There are displays of wild animals. Famously, a large serpent from Africa was put on display in the Theater of Marcellus. Times the use of the theaters for public orations, political gatherings, especially in the provinces. We also have records of the execution of Christian martyrs as a form of public spectacle in the theaters. And of course, there are many records of imperial cult ceremonies taking place inside the theater. So when we look now at the Roman theater, we can examine the components of the Roman era. The cavea, seats were arranged by social class. The orchestra, which is smaller in the Roman circumstance, sometimes reserved for elite seating, not for the chorus. The pulpitum was the raised stage where the actors could be elevated above the audience. The Scanae fronds, the magnificent multi-level backdrop, a visual feast framing every story, and the velarium, the giant awnings that shaded spectators, a grand Roman engineering feat at its finest. And we can examine these components in a number of Roman-era theaters throughout the empire. Let's start with 2 of the best preserved from the ancient world. Here is a model of the theater from Aspendos in Turkey. And here is an analogous theater that we can walk through from top to bottom from Orange in southern France. Both of these theaters have spectacularly well-preserved Scene France buildings in front of which the actors perform. And we can even see on the outer walls the brackets for holding the wooden masts to which there were attached the velarium awnings to keep the spectators in the shade. We can look to the reconstructed marble components of the Scene France in Mérida in Spain to get a sense of the spectacle created by multiple stories of the colonnades. We can find examples of Roman-era theaters in Segobriga in Italica, Italica being the birthplace of Trajan. We can turn to the magnificent theater of Sabratha in Libya, the Augustan Theater in Albania, the city of Butrint, the poorly preserved freestanding theater in Salona in Croatia, the magnificent Greek-style theater in Amman of the Antonine period, located next to the Roman Forum, carved from the living rock in Petra, further expanded under the Romans after Petra became part of the Roman province in 106. The Roman theater mirrored the empire itself, grand, layered, diverse. Through drama, satire, spectacle, and more, Romans told the story of who they were and who they wanted to be. Thanks for watching. This is Ancient Rome Live. Hit the like button and subscribe. And of course, we're taking you all throughout the Mediterranean to look at aspects of the Roman Empire through the ages.